Mrs. Ruth Johnson had spent nearly 74 years in Montgomery, Alabama, a city steeped in history and rich with stories. Yet, if you were to ask anyone in the neighborhood about her, they would speak of her with a quiet reverence, like a living piece of history. Ruth wasn't a woman who demanded attention. She didn't need to. The soft squeak of her little cart, the one with the metal wheels that she dragged behind her every Tuesday, was all the notice she ever required. It wasn't just a cart, it was a part of her. A constant companion. It had weathered the years just like her, standing as a testament to a life lived with dignity and quiet grace. Her weekly routine was simple. Every Tuesday, rain or shine, Ruth would walk the few blocks from her home to the Piggly Wiggly on North Main Street. For nearly 40 years, she had followed this same path, stopping to pick up what she needed for the week, engaging in the familiar rhythm of life that most would take for granted. The neighborhood knew Ruth well. She was the slender, elderly black woman who always wore a smile, her eyes kind yet filled with the wisdom of a life well lived. In a world where many seemed to rush from one place to another, Ruth's unhurried pace stood as a quiet rebellion. She had lived through some of the toughest periods in American history, and yet she carried no bitterness. Instead, Ruth was the embodiment of grace. The kind of grace that doesn't come easily, but is forged over decades of choosing kindness, compassion, and dignity in the face of adversity. Her life had been marked by loss, but Ruth had never allowed it to define her. After Walter, her husband, had passed away in 1998, she continued to live in the home they had shared. Walter had bought the house with his VA benefits after returning from the Vietnam War, and it was there they had made a life together. After his death, Ruth could have retreated into grief. She could have allowed the silence of the house to consume her, but instead, she found purpose in helping others. Every week, she volunteered at the local church, reading to children at the library, and living her life in a way that reminded everyone around her that love and service were the true measures of success. As Ruth walked through the entrance of the Piggly Wiggly, the scent of fresh fruit and vegetables greeted her, a small comfort that made the chore of shopping feel a little less mundane. She made her way past the produce section, her sharp eyes scanning the peaches for ripeness, as she always did. It was a ritual, this checking of the peaches, and Ruth took her time, selecting only the best for her little kitchen at home. But as she bent down to examine a particularly plump peach, something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a slight sensation at the back of her neck. The hairs on her arms prickled, and her senses went on high alert. She could feel it. Eyes were on her. Ruth had learned long ago to trust her instincts. They had served her well in a world that had often been less than kind. But this feeling was different. It wasn't the usual stare she got from passing strangers, or the occasional glance from curious shoppers. This was something more sinister, something heavy, a presence that made the air in the store feel thick and uncomfortable. She straightened up, her fingers still wrapped around the peach, and took a slow glance around. A group of teenagers was standing a few aisles over. Their laughter was loud and raucous, but it wasn't the kind of innocent joy that teenagers are known for. This laughter had an edge to it. Ruth's sharp eyes caught their gaze, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. They were looking at her, really looking at her. Ruth could feel their eyes sizing her up, evaluating her. They were talking amongst themselves, their words muffled by the distance, but the tension in the air was palpable. Ruth could sense that they weren't just passing the time with idle chatter. No, they were planning something. Ruth's grip on the peach tightened. She didn't know what it was, but something told her this would not be an ordinary trip to the store. Something was about to happen, and she wasn't sure whether it would be the kind of test she had the strength to face. But one thing was certain. Ruth Johnson had lived a life that taught her how to stand her ground, even in the face of adversity. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and decided to move on, continuing down the aisle as if nothing had changed. But the feeling didn't go away. It only intensified. She could feel their eyes following her every step. And it wasn't long before Ruth would find out exactly what these young men had planned. Little did she know, what started as a quiet Tuesday afternoon would soon spiral into a confrontation that would change her life forever, and teach these teenagers, and everyone who witnessed it, a lesson they would never forget. As Ruth moved down the aisle, her footsteps were steady, each one echoing softly in the nearly empty store. She tried to focus on her shopping, picking out a carton of milk and some eggs, but she could feel the weight of the teenagers' eyes on her, a constant pressure that gnawed at her from behind. It was almost as if they were waiting for something. Ruth could sense that whatever it wasn't going to be good. The store, which had once felt like a place of comfort, now seemed suffocating, each breath heavy with anticipation. The teens' laughter grew louder as she moved closer to the canned goods aisle. Ruth couldn't help but overhear bits and pieces of their conversation, their words laced with a cruel, mocking tone. She heard one of them say, "Look at her, probably doesn't even know how to use a credit card." Another snickered, "She's too old to be out here alone." The words stung, but Ruth did her best to ignore them. She had been called worse, had endured far worse in her life. People, especially in the South, had often found ways to insult her because of her age or her race, or sometimes simply because of her quiet strength. But Ruth had learned long ago that the best way to deal with people like that was to keep moving forward, to rise above it. But this time felt different. The mockery was one thing, but there was something in the way they spoke, a venom that she hadn't sensed before. Ruth's heart rate quickened slightly, but she refused to let it show. She wasn't going to let these young men intimidate her, not today. She walked past the aisle, hoping they would move on, but the tension in the air was palpable. She could hear the shuffling of footsteps, a quick movement behind her, and then the sound of one of them calling out, "Hey, lady, you dropped something." The voice was loud, drawing the attention of anyone nearby. Ruth paused, her fingers tightening around the cart's handle, but she didn't turn around. She knew what they were trying to do. They wanted to get a rise out of her, to make her respond so they could laugh at her expense. But Ruth wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. She continued to push the cart forward, her pace unwavering. She wasn't going to let them break her, not today. However, the young man wasn't done. Ruth heard his footsteps growing louder behind her as he closed the distance, the sound of his sneakers against the linoleum floor unmistakable. Before she could react, she felt a sharp tug on the back of her cart. "Hey, I said you dropped something," the boy repeated, his voice now dripping with mockery. Ruth's grip tightened on the cart, and she stopped, but she didn't turn around. She could feel the heat of his presence, a heavy, uncomfortable proximity that made her skin crawl. For a split second, Ruth thought about walking away. She could leave. She could finish her shopping and go home to the safety of her house, where she was in control. But no, Ruth had lived through far worse. She had seen too much injustice to let these boys get away with it. She wasn't going to let them think they could treat her like this, like she was invisible or powerless. Ruth finally turned, her eyes locking onto the teenager's face. He was no older than 17 or 18, and his friends were standing a few feet away, watching eagerly, hoping for a spectacle. Ruth didn't flinch. Instead, she took a slow breath, her eyes never leaving his. "Is there a problem, young man?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The boy paused, thrown off by her composed response. His friends, too, seemed a bit surprised by her calm demeanor. For a moment, the tension in the air seemed to evaporate. But then, one of the other boys, a slightly taller, bolder figure, stepped forward with a smug grin on his face. "Yeah, we've got a problem," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "We don't like seeing old people like you taking up space in here. You should be at home, not out here with us." The words were meant to provoke her, to strip her of her dignity. Ruth could feel the sting of the insult, but she refused to let them see it. She didn't move, didn't blink. Her gaze never wavered from the boy who had spoken. "How about you leave her alone?" Another voice suddenly cut through the tension. It was a voice that was calm yet filled with authority, one that carried the weight of experience. It was a voice that belonged to someone who was no stranger to standing up for what was right. The group of teenagers froze, their laughter dying in their throats as they turned toward the new voice. At first, Ruth didn't recognize the man who had spoken. He was tall, with a strong build, wearing a simple white t-shirt and dark jeans. His presence seemed to radiate an almost magnetic energy, one that immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the store. His gaze was steady, his posture straight, and there was an undeniable sense of calm authority in the way he carried himself. Ruth's heart skipped a beat when she recognized him. It was none other than Vin Diesel, the actor, the star from the Fast and Furious movies. She had seen him on the screen countless times, but never, in her wildest dreams, had she imagined running into him at her local grocery store, especially not under these circumstances. The teenagers, still stunned, seemed unsure of how to react. They had clearly underestimated the situation, thinking they could just pick on an elderly woman without consequences. But now, faced with the towering figure of Vin Diesel, their bravado began to wane. "Who do you think you are, old man?" one of them sneered, trying to muster up some defiance. Vin Diesel didn't even flinch. His eyes locked onto the teenager with a quiet intensity that immediately made the group of boys realize they were no longer the ones in control. "I'm someone who doesn't take kindly to bullies," he said, his voice steady and filled with an unmistakable authority. "And you'd better get used to the idea that this lady, this incredible woman, deserves more respect than you'll ever understand." The tension in the store shifted dramatically. Ruth stood frozen, watching this stranger, who had just moments ago been a figure on a screen, now standing beside her, defending her with a strength she had never expected. The teenager who had been most vocal took a step back, clearly uncomfortable, but still reluctant to back down. Vin Diesel's next words were simple, but they carried weight. "You think it's funny to pick on someone who can't fight back? Let me tell you something. Real strength comes not from bullying the weak, but from lifting others up." Ruth felt a sense of warmth spread through her chest, a feeling of being seen, of being heard. For so long, she had endured countless slights, small and large, from people who didn't know her story, who didn't understand her strength. But today, in the unlikeliest of places, someone had stepped up for her, showing the kind of courage and compassion she had always believed in. It wasn't the kind of thing she expected to see, but it was exactly the kind of thing she needed to remind her that there was still good in the world. And as the group of teenagers began to retreat, clearly cowed by the unexpected intervention, Ruth felt a wave of relief wash over her. But she also felt something else, something more powerful. The lesson they had just learned wasn't just for the teenagers. It was for everyone who had ever felt powerless, for anyone who had ever been silenced by fear or intimidation. Today, Ruth had not only stood her ground, but she had been reminded of her own strength, and how, no matter the circumstances, she could always stand tall. The air in the store began to settle after the confrontation, and for a few moments, the only sound that could be heard was the soft shuffle of feet and the hum of fluorescent lights above. Ruth remained standing in the aisle, her cart unmoving, her heart still racing, but her posture as composed as ever. The teenagers had backed off, retreating with their tails between their legs, a group of young men who had been outplayed by a woman who had lived through more than they could ever imagine. Vin Diesel stood beside her, his imposing figure like a shield, but he hadn't said much more. He didn't need to. His mere presence had spoken volumes. Ruth wasn't sure what to do next. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. She didn't like it. For years, she had lived a quiet life, filled with routine and service to others, but never with the spotlight shining directly on her. But as she stood there in the midst of the store, she could feel the eyes of those around her, the other shoppers who had witnessed what had just transpired. They were all waiting for something. Maybe for Ruth to speak, maybe for her to acknowledge the moment. But Ruth was a woman who valued grace over drama. She wasn't going to make a scene. Instead, she turned slowly toward Vin Diesel, who was now standing with his hands at his sides, a calm expression on his face, though his eyes still held that quiet strength. "Thank you," Ruth said, her voice soft but sincere. "You didn't have to do that." Vin Diesel glanced at her, his expression softening. "I'm glad I could help," he said, his voice deep and reassuring. "But you didn't need me to. You handled that situation better than anyone could have." Ruth smiled, the corners of her mouth lifting just slightly. "I've learned to handle myself," she replied, though her eyes glistened with a touch of vulnerability. "A lifetime of. Well, let's just say there are some battles you fight with your dignity, not your fists." Vin nodded. He had seen that kind of strength before. It wasn't the kind of strength that was obvious or loud. It wasn't the type of strength that came from physicality or brute force. No, this was the kind of strength that was earned over years of perseverance, of weathering the storms of life, of knowing how to keep walking even when the path was difficult. Ruth didn't just have the strength to stand up to those teenagers. She had the strength to live a life that was full of grace, even when the world around her wasn't kind. Ruth gave a small nod, acknowledging the understanding between them. "I've seen a lot in my time," she said, her voice quieter now, almost reflective. "I've seen things that would make a person lose their faith in the world. But I also seen enough good to know it's worth holding on to." Vin Diesel studied her, sensing the weight of her words, the depth of experience that lay behind them. He had always admired people who carried their histories with such quiet dignity, people who, despite the many hardships they had faced, never lost their ability to see the world in terms of grace and compassion. Ruth's quiet strength reminded him of something he had always known but sometimes struggled to remember. The power of resilience, the ability to keep going, to find hope even in the darkest of times. The two of them stood in silence for a moment, each processing the events that had just unfolded in their own way. Ruth's hand rested gently on the handle of her cart, but her mind was elsewhere, drifting back to the many years she had spent walking the streets of Montgomery. She thought about her husband, Walter, and how proud he had been when they bought their home together, their little house where they had made a life. She thought about the struggles they had both endured, his time in Vietnam, her own battles as a black woman in the South, but also about the simple joys they had shared. The quiet evenings spent together on the porch, the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven, the laughter of children filling their home during the holidays. Her thoughts returned to the present, and she glanced up at Vin Diesel, who was still standing beside her. There was something about him, something about the way he carried himself with such humility, despite his fame. It was as if he understood that life was bigger than the roles he played in movies, bigger than the recognition and accolades. It was the simple moments, the real moments, that mattered most. And perhaps, in a way, that's why he had come to her aid today. Because he, too, recognized the value of standing up for what was right, even in the most unexpected of circumstances. The moment stretched on for a while, and Ruth realized that the store around them had grown quiet. Shoppers had stopped their routines to watch the scene unfold, but now they were returning to their shopping with a new sense of understanding, a new respect for the quiet strength Ruth had shown. They had seen something today, something that transcended the typical drama of a confrontation. They had witnessed a real-life act of courage, of standing up for what was right, even in the face of adversity. Vin Diesel turned toward the checkout lanes, motioning for Ruth to follow him. "I think it's time we get you checked out, don't you think?" Ruth hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "I suppose so." As they made their way toward the register, Ruth felt a sense of peace wash over her. The tension of the moment had passed, and she could once again breathe freely. But more than that, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just the protection from the teenagers that had made her feel empowered. It was the reminder that she still had a role to play in this world. She wasn't done yet. There were still people to help, still a legacy to create. When they reached the register, Vin turned to her with a small smile. "If you ever need help with anything at all, you just let me know. I may be a movie star, but I'm just a guy who believes in doing the right thing." Ruth smiled, her eyes softening with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Diesel. But I think I've got it from here. I've handled my share of challenges." Vin chuckled. "I can tell." As Ruth finished paying for her groceries, she realized that this encounter, however brief, had changed something inside her. It wasn't just about the confrontation at the store. It was about remembering her own strength, about understanding that she wasn't powerless, that she still had something valuable to offer the world. As she walked out of the store, her little cart squeaking behind her, Ruth felt the weight of the years lift just a little. She was still here, still walking, still strong. And she knew, deep in her heart, that no matter what came her way, she would face it with the same grace, the same courage, and the same unshakable belief that goodness still had a place in this world. As Ruth stepped outside the Piggly Wiggly, the warm air of the Montgomery afternoon wrapped around her, a familiar embrace. The sun was beginning its descent, casting a soft golden glow over the parking lot, but it didn't escape Ruth's notice that something had shifted in the way people looked at her. As she walked toward her car, she noticed several people glance in her direction, some offering subtle nods of acknowledgement, others with expressions that seemed to mix admiration with quiet reflection. The encounter in the store hadn't just affected the teenagers. It had affected everyone who had witnessed it. And now, as Ruth pushed her cart slowly toward her old sedan, she realized that she was carrying something more than just groceries. She was carrying the weight of a moment that had changed the air around her. It wasn't that she had wanted the attention, but somehow, by standing her ground in the face of such aggression, she had become something of a symbol, a reminder to those around her that respect, dignity, and kindness still had a place in a world that often seemed to be forgetting them. Ruth placed the bags in the trunk of her car, the familiar creak of the lid a comforting sound. She paused for a moment, her hand resting on the trunk. As she took a slow, deep breath, she felt a small surge of pride, but it was tempered with something else, something deeper. This wasn't about the recognition. This wasn't about the confrontation. It was about the reminder of what she had lived through, what she had learned, and what she still had to offer. As she drove home, the streets of Montgomery unfurling before her, Ruth's mind wandered back to the years she had spent in this town. She thought of the history that had shaped her, the struggles she had endured, and the quiet moments of joy that had kept her going. There had been a time, years ago, when she might have felt helpless in the face of cruelty, when the weight of the world would have seemed too much to bear. But life had a way of teaching you how to endure, how to keep going even when it felt like everything was against you. Ruth had been born in Montgomery, a place where history had been written in ways both painful and powerful. She had grown up during a time when the civil rights movement was in full swing, when the streets of this very city had echoed with the voices of those who demanded justice, equality, and dignity. She had been just a girl at the time, but she had seen enough to understand the power of standing up for what was right, even when the world seemed to be turning its back on you. Her own father had been a quiet man, a man who didn't speak much, but whose actions had always spoken louder than words. He had been a mechanic, working long hours to provide for his family, never asking for much in return. He had been a man who knew that hard work and integrity were more valuable than anything money could buy. Ruth had watched him face adversity with the same quiet strength that she had come to embrace in her own life. And then there was Walter, her husband. Ruth could still picture the way he had looked when they first met. The confident, handsome young man with a smile that could light up any room. He had come back from Vietnam a changed man, but the love they shared had been the one thing that had kept them both grounded. Walter had been her rock, the one person who understood the quiet struggles she faced as a black woman in a world that didn't always see her worth. His death had left a void that Ruth had never fully been able to fill, but it had also taught her something about the resilience of the human spirit. Life went on, even after loss. Now, at 74, Ruth's life was quieter, but that didn't mean it was less meaningful. She had built a life for herself in this town, a life that was full of purpose, of small acts of kindness, of service to others. She volunteered at the local church, read to children at the library, and took care of her garden with the same meticulous care she had used to care for her home. But something about today, something about standing up to those boys in the store, had awakened something inside her, something that had been lying dormant for years. She wasn't done yet. When she arrived home, Ruth parked her car in front of the house that Walter had bought with his VA benefits, the house they had made their own all those years ago. The little brick house that had seen laughter, love, and the quiet moments of life that had built the foundation of who she was. It was a place that still felt like home, even in his absence. She stepped out of the car and walked up the small path to the front door, the familiar creak of the wooden steps beneath her feet. The porch, where she had spent so many evenings with Walter, was still the same, though it was a little emptier now. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, the cool air of the house a welcome contrast to the heat of the day. Inside, Ruth took a moment to take it all in. The old photographs on the walls, the comfortable armchairs that had once been filled with guests, the scent of freshly brewed coffee from this morning still lingering in the air. It was quiet, but it wasn't empty. There was life here, and it was her life. Ruth walked into the kitchen and began putting away the groceries, her mind still processing the events of the day. The way the boys had tried to bully her. The way Vin Diesel had come to her aid without hesitation. She thought about the words he had said, the way he had stood up for her, and how he had reminded her of something important. It wasn't just about defending herself from the cruelty of others. It was about standing up for the things that truly mattered. It was about dignity, respect, and kindness. Ruth placed the last item in the cupboard and stood there for a moment, her hands resting on the counter as she thought. She had always known that her life was more than the sum of its parts. It was more than just the years she had lived, the hardships she had faced, or the quiet work she did for her community. Her life was about the impact she had on others, the way she made people feel seen, heard, and valued. And today, she had been reminded that even in her quietest moments, she could make a difference. There was a knock at the door, and Ruth's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. She moved toward the door, cautious but curious, and opened it slowly. Standing there, with a small smile on his face, was Vin Diesel. "Just wanted to check in," he said, his voice warm and genuine. "Make sure you're all right." Ruth looked up at him, surprised but touched by the gesture. She hadn't expected him to come back, but there he was, offering a kindness that went beyond the unexpected rescue of the store. "Thank you," she said again, her voice filled with gratitude. "You didn't have to." Vin smiled. Sometimes it's the little things that make the biggest difference. And in that moment, Ruth realized that it wasn't just about standing up to bullies or proving her own strength. It was about the connections we make with others, the way we show up for each other, even in the most unlikely circumstances. Life, she thought, was full of surprises, but it was also full of moments of grace, moments when we find strength in each other and in ourselves. And those moments, those were the ones that truly made all the difference. The days that followed the incident at the Piggly Wiggly were quieter than Ruth had expected, but they were no less impactful. Life in Montgomery seemed to return to its usual rhythm, but there was a shift in the atmosphere, subtle, almost imperceptible to those who weren't paying attention. The air felt a little lighter, the interactions between people a bit warmer. Ruth had always believed in the power of small acts of kindness, but now she saw that they could ripple out, influencing things in ways she couldn't have imagined. The young men who had tried to bully her hadn't returned to the store. She hadn't heard a word from them since that afternoon, but Ruth wasn't concerned. She wasn't interested in seeking revenge or forcing an apology. Her sense of justice wasn't rooted in retribution. What mattered to her was that they had learned something that day, something beyond the lesson of respect. Ruth had lived a long life, and she knew that true change wasn't about quick fixes or dramatic moments. It was about quiet, sustained effort, about allowing the seeds of understanding to grow at their own pace. A few days after the incident, Ruth received a letter. She wasn't accustomed to receiving much mail besides the occasional bill or church newsletter, so when she saw the return address on the envelope, she couldn't help but feel a sense of curiosity. It was from the local high school, and the words "Special Invitation" were printed in bold letters on the front. She had no idea what this could be about, but her heart quickened as she tore open the envelope. Inside, she found a handwritten letter from the principal, a man she had known from her volunteer work at the library. The letter expressed deep gratitude for her handling of the situation at the store and how it had sparked something in the community. He spoke of how the students of the high school had been talking about what had happened, how they had discussed it in their classrooms, and how it had led to a larger conversation about respect, dignity, and the importance of standing up for what's right. The principal invited her to come to the school to speak to the students, to share her story and wisdom with the next generation. At first, Ruth wasn't sure if she was the right person for such a task. She hadn't been a teacher or public speaker. She didn't feel like her life was something that needed to be shared with others. But then, as she sat in her living room that evening, the letter resting in her lap, Ruth realized that this wasn't just about her. It was about the impact she could have on others. It was about giving voice to the quiet strength she had carried for so many years, the lessons she had learned, and the hope that there was still goodness to be found in the world. The next morning, Ruth called the principal and accepted the invitation. The day of the speech arrived, and Ruth found herself standing in front of a group of teenagers, her heart beating in her chest. The students were seated in the auditorium, and their eyes were all on her. Ruth wasn't sure what she had expected, but this wasn't it. The room was filled with youthful energy, but also with an air of uncertainty. They were still trying to figure out who they were and what they stood for, and Ruth could see that they were waiting for her words to carry weight. She stepped up to the microphone, her hands trembling slightly. But she steadied herself, drawing from the same quiet strength that had carried her through so much in her life. Ruth took a deep breath and began. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'm Ruth Johnson, and I'm here today because of an incident that happened recently. Some young men thought it would be funny to pick on me, to bully me in a way that was meant to make them feel powerful. And I won't lie, for a moment, I was startled. But then something changed. I didn't just stand there in fear. I didn't respond with anger or hate. I stood with my dignity, and I let them know that I wouldn't tolerate being treated like that." Ruth paused, looking out at the sea of students in front of her. She saw a mix of expressions, some skeptical, others curious, and a few who were visibly moved by her words. "I know that some of you have probably experienced something similar," she continued, "whether it was bullying at school or being overlooked or being made to feel less than you are. But I want you to understand something very important. The way people treat you doesn't define your worth. It's the way you respond that defines you. You have the power to choose how you carry yourself in this world, no matter what others say or do." Ruth's words hung in the air, and for the first time, she noticed a shift in the room. The students were listening, really listening. She wasn't just telling them a story about what had happened to her. She was sharing a truth, something that resonated deep within them. Her voice gained strength as she continued. "I didn't get to where I am by being a victim. I didn't survive the struggles of my life by letting people walk all over me. But I also didn't survive by becoming bitter or angry. I survived by holding on to my belief that goodness can be found in the world, and by standing up for the things that matter most: respect, dignity, love. And I believe that if each of you takes a moment to ask yourself what truly matters, you'll find that you have the strength to face whatever comes your way." There was a silence in the room now, a quiet reverence that spoke louder than words. Ruth wasn't sure how long she spoke, but when she finally finished, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't looking for applause, but she heard it anyway, a soft, sincere clapping that seemed to come from the heart of the room. As she stepped down from the stage, several students came up to her, each of them eager to express their gratitude. One young girl, who had been sitting near the front, gave Ruth a hug, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "I needed to hear that today. You don't know how much it means to me." Ruth smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. She had never thought of herself as a teacher, but in that moment, she realized that perhaps she was more of a teacher than she had ever imagined. It wasn't about the formal lessons in a classroom. It was about the lessons we learned from the lives we lived, the stories we shared, and the example we set for others. As Ruth left the school that day, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had shared her story, but more importantly, she had given those students a gift of hope, of understanding, and of the belief that they, too, could rise above their circumstances. And maybe, just maybe, that was the true purpose of her life: to inspire others to be their best selves, to face the world with dignity and grace, no matter what it threw their way. She was no longer just a woman living in Montgomery. She was a voice for resilience, a beacon of hope for those who needed it most. And as Ruth walked out into the world, she knew that the impact of her words and her life would continue to echo long after she was gone. In the weeks that followed Ruth's speech, life took on a different rhythm. Though she didn't expect fame or widespread recognition, the ripples of her words seemed to stretch far beyond what she could have imagined. She had become, in her quiet way, a local symbol of strength and grace. People who had seen her that day at the store began to approach her more frequently, whether it was at the church, at the library, or even just walking down the street. There was a respect in their eyes, a renewed sense of appreciation for the wisdom she had shared, not just that day, but over the years. It wasn't about the standing ovations or the public recognition. It was the way people had begun to reflect on their own actions. Ruth's unassuming presence had sparked something within her community, something small but powerful. In a world that so often seemed to reward loudness and spectacle, Ruth's quiet resilience was like a soft but persistent call to look deeper at how we treat one another. It wasn't enough to merely exist in the world. We had to truly be in the world, kindly, compassionately, and with a sense of purpose. Ruth continued her usual routine, doing what she had always done, but now with a newfound sense of fulfillment. Her days were filled with small acts of kindness. She still read to children at the library, helped organize events at the church, and checked in on her neighbors, offering a listening ear and a warm smile. Her life was still simple, but it felt richer, more meaningful. And every so often, she would think back to that moment at the store, to the way Vin Diesel had stepped in, to the way the whole world seemed to pause and take notice. It had been a reminder that sometimes, when you least expect it, help comes in the most unexpected forms. But there was more that Ruth had learned, more that she had yet to discover. One afternoon, several months after the incident at the store, Ruth was sitting on her porch, enjoying the cool evening breeze, when a knock at her door startled her. She wasn't expecting company, but when she opened the door, she was greeted by the familiar face of the principal from the high school. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Johnson," he said with a warm smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to come by and check in after your visit to the school." Ruth smiled, ushering him inside. "No disturbance at all," she replied. "I'm glad to see you. How are things at the school?" He sat down at the kitchen table, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. "Actually," he said, "I wanted to talk to you about something. Since your speech, I've been working with the students, trying to integrate some of the lessons you shared into our curriculum. And I have to say, it's made a difference. A lot of them have started to rethink how they treat others. There's been a noticeable change in the atmosphere here. More kindness, more understanding, and less judgment." Ruth listened intently, her heart swelling with quiet pride. She had never set out to be a catalyst for change. She had simply wanted to share her story. But hearing that her words had made a difference was more than she had hoped for. The principal continued, his voice tinged with excitement. "There's something else," he said. "I've been talking with the school board, and we're planning to launch a new initiative focused on empathy, respect, and kindness, something that's grounded in real-life experiences. We want to name the program after you, Mrs. Johnson, a way to honor what you've done and continue spreading those lessons to future generations. Ruth was taken aback. Me, she said softly. You want to name a program after me? The principal nodded. Yes. Your story has inspired so many people, and it feels like the right thing to do. We want the students to learn that no matter who you are, where you come from, or what you've been through, you have the power to make a difference. Your life is a testament to that. For a moment, Ruth was silent, processing the unexpected turn of events. She wasn't accustomed to being in the spotlight, to receiving such recognition. But as she sat there, looking at the principal, she realized something. It wasn't about her. It wasn't about the title or the recognition. It was about the message she had carried all these years, the message that kindness and dignity could change the world, one person at a time. Well, Ruth said, finally breaking the silence, if it will help someone else, if it can inspire others the way I've been inspired, then I'm honored. But I want you to make sure the focus remains on what really matters, treating each other with respect and understanding. That's the real lesson. The principal smiled. We'll make sure of that. Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. Your words have already made more of an impact than you know. As he left, Ruth stood on the porch, gazing out at the street where she had walked countless times before. It was quiet as it always was, but somehow it felt different now. There was a sense of peace, a sense of fulfillment that she had never expected to find at this stage of her life. Ruth had always known that the value of a life wasn't measured in accomplishments or accolades. It was measured in the love and kindness you shared with others, in the way you treated those around you, and in the quiet strength that allowed you to weather life's storms with grace. Ruth had lived through so much in her 74 years. She had seen the world change in ways both painful and beautiful. But through it all, she had learned that the most important thing was the way you showed up for others. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about being human. And sometimes, being human meant showing compassion when it wasn't easy, standing up for yourself when it was hard, and offering a helping hand even when you didn't know if it would be accepted. In the end, Ruth's story wasn't about the confrontation in the store or the recognition she had received afterward. It was about something much deeper. It was about the power of one person to make a difference, the ripple effect that kindness could create, and the way small, everyday acts of courage and dignity could change the world. Ruth had spent her life living that truth, and now it was being carried forward in a way she had never imagined. She smiled as she looked out at the street, knowing that her life, in its quiet, unassuming way, had left a mark on the world. And in that moment, Ruth felt a profound sense of peace. She had done what she set out to do, not by seeking attention, but by living with purpose and standing tall in the face of life's challenges. The impact of her story, she knew, would echo long after she was gone. It was the power of the ordinary person living an extraordinary life, and it was a gift that would continue to give.